We're gonna get started. Thank you all for being here. I know it's busy times. Yeah, so enjoy. I think there are a few more people who are gonna pop in at some point, but if you just sit down. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead and start when you're ready.
Okay, did you want to introduce me or should I introduce myself?
If you would like to introduce yourself, this is William Robinson, professor. I would have to go back into my email.
Sure, no problem. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm William Robinson, professor of sociology, the University of California at Santa Barbara. Mina, thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you to you and to the Rohr Center. Also, I don't know if John Monroe is in the audience there, but he first reached out to me in the fall, and I'd like to thank him as well, and Jason Schreiner, who also contacted me and I believe helped organize this. And a shout out to Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voices for Peace. Hang in there, stay strong. I know we're under all-out attack. And as all of you know, the genocide is in full force in Gaza. The Israeli Defense Force of the Israeli military is militarily reoccupying the whole strip. And as you also know, several hundred thousands of people are facing mass starvation and death by starvation. So I'm going to jump right into this. And I know that there was an encampment on your campus and, of course, over 200 campuses. And I think that October 7 really sparked or led to a turning point, a global intifada in solidarity with Palestine. And as I'm going to try and elaborate in this talk, really October of 2023, and then the encampments is really a catalyst for something much bigger, for a turning point, not just with regard to worldwide solidarity with Palestine, but also with regard to the global conjuncture of crisis and struggle that we face right now. And I don't think I need to tell a public such as this that this false claim of anti-Zionism, the claim that anti-Zionism and that opposition to genocide is somehow anti-Semitism, we know that that's an absolute farce, but specifically it's an attempt to exercise this extreme censorship, intimidation, and criminalization of supporters of Palestinian freedom. But more than that, if this is right now, this charge of anti-Semitism is not just for censorship and suppression of solidarity with Palestine, but it's really the leading edge of attempts to suppress, censor, and criminalize all political dissent at this point. If we let the system get away with this with Palestine solidarity, they will move on to general regime of censorship and criminalization of all opposition. This is really was the very first victim of this pogrom now was Mahmoud Khalil kidnapped for opposing genocide, and really a symbol of weaponizing migrant status and criminalization of migrants. So what we're seeing here is the persecution of migrants is coming together with the repression of Palestine solidarity. And as I stated, or as I wrote here on the left side of the screen, every ICE arrest is political. Every migrant worker locked up is a political prisoner. The war on immigrants, more than scapegoating, is a campaign to instill fear, establish political conditions for control and for exploitation. So the war on immigrants, and by the way, the title of my talk is The Global Meaning of Gaza, from Genocide in Palestine to ICE raids in California. So I want to try and link Palestine. What is this global meaning of Palestine, and what does it tell us about more generally the crisis that we're facing? So the war on immigrants is an all-out war on the entire working class, with immigrant workers on the front line. And in turn, as I'm going to try and show here, this is linked also to the genocide against Palestine and the criminalization of Palestine solidarity. As Khalil stated, and I quote here, "I am writing to you from a detention facility in Louisiana. Who has the right to have rights? It is certainly not the humans crowded into the cells here. It isn't the Senegalese man I met who has been deprived of his liberty for a year, his legal situation in limbo, his family an ocean away. It isn't the 21-year-old detainee I met who stepped foot in this country at age 9, only to be deported without so much as a hearing. The Trump administration is targeting me as a part of a broader strategy to suppress dissent. Visa holders, green card carriers, and citizens alike will all be targeted for their political beliefs. So I'm going to suggest that genocidal pressures have been built right from the start. Right from even before 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, genocidal pressures have been built into the Zionist project and also now built into a global capitalism that is in deep crisis. And I suggest to you that this moment of genocide would have eventually come absent one of two things happening: either the defeat of the Zionist project or an end to unconditional US support for Israel and for Zionism. So the question is here, why genocide? Why now? And I'm going to suggest that the why now is linked to the global crisis. So October 7, 2023 really does not explain this genocide. Rather, we can consider that what we call a precipitating event. So what I want to do, I want to link the genocide in Palestine to the crisis of global capitalism, bringing it right up to date to what's going on in 2025. But first, we need to step back for a few slides and talk about the nature of Zionism. And some of you may be very familiar with this and others not. But as you know, Zionism is a political program of colonialism. It has absolutely nothing to do with religion or ethnicity. And many people may be surprised to learn, well, first, that there's more Christians than Jewish Zionists. But secondly, Zionism doesn't emerge among any Jewish population. Zionism emerges in the 16 and 1700s after the Reformation as part of Christian fundamentalism. The Christian fundamentalist interpretation from the 1600s right up until the 20th and now the 21st century is that the second coming of Christ will not take place until there is a resurrection and then consolidation of a Jewish kingdom. Then that Jewish kingdom will be overthrown when Christ comes back. And at that time, Jews will either have to convert to Christianity or they will get straight down to hell and rot in hell forever. So that's the origin of Zionism, not even any Jewish community. But in the United States, what's been called the Israel lobby is the most powerful lobby in this country, in the United States, but it's really more than a lobby. We think of a lobby in terms of, for instance, the gun lobby, where they have offices set up next to Congress and they go to legislatures to try and lobby Congress people to not pass gun control laws. That's how a lobby functions, but this is something much, much more. Really, this Israel lobby is fused into the entire US political system, into public institutions, such as our universities, into civil society itself. And we see it's so overwhelming that journalists, politicians, academics, and even activists, such as ourselves, self-censor out of fear and intimidation. And so now we are experiencing this unprecedented wave of repression and criminalization. Hasbara is a Hebrew word which means to explain, but that is a polite word for propaganda. And the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military, and the Israeli Foreign Ministry have set up Hasbara branches to operate worldwide. And so we can only describe what this involves as mass psychological operations against the U.S. and the global public. Really, the Israel lobby and this Hasbara is one of the most powerful propaganda machineries on the planet. And inside the United States, and you're experiencing this surely at the University of Oregon, there's numerous front organizations that behind which stands this Zionist project and the Israel lobby, including the Anti-Defamation League, which at this point has nothing to do with anti-defamation, the AIPAC, of course, which you're all familiar with, the David Project, AMCHA, Canary Mission, and most recently Betar. Betar, really a fascist Zionist organization now operating throughout the United States. No, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and we're going to see that in some detail in just a moment. Zionism is a project of the far right that defends Israel. And the irony here is that anti-Semites, real anti-Semites, defined as discrimination against or hatred of Jews, real anti-Semites are in fact Zionists. They are fascist Zionists. The incredible irony is that you remember in the first Trump administration, I believe it was 2017, you had the Unite the Right rally in Charlotte, North Carolina. And they were shouting, Jews will not take us over. Jews will not take us over. Here you have far-right fascist anti-Semites. And at the same time, they are raising the flag of Israel. and defending Zionism. You have this incredible irony. No, there are not two warring sides in Palestine. This is not an Israel-Palestine conflict any more than we would have referred to the Nazi persecution of Jews as a Nazi-Jewish conflict. This is not a war going on in Gaza. This is a genocide, and there is a very significant difference. Now, you always hear that Israel has the right to defend itself. You always hear that from the US government and Western governments in trying to legitimate their unconditional support and sponsorship, really now, of genocide. But we would not have said that the South African apartheid regime had a right to defend itself against the anti-apartheid struggle. No, we wouldn't have said that the Nazis had a right to defend themselves against anyone that resisted Nazi fascism. And moreover, international law is very clear here. International law says that a country can defend itself from external aggression, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, such as the US invasion of Iraq in 2023. But the Palestinians are not external aggression. They are in their homeland. So no, Jews are not a people, and we're going to elaborate on what I mean by that. And they do not trace their ancestry back to Palestine. And no, Israel is not a democracy. It is an illegal apartheid state, literally an outlaw state, which is violated in any and every international law that possibly exists, continuously on a daily, permanent basis. So before I go, again, the heart of this talk is to discuss the current conjuncture, what's going on, explaining this genocide and how is it unfolding, what is the larger meaning of this genocide for humanity in 2025. But before I get to that, I want to go into a little background detail for those of you not familiar with the history of exactly what Zionism is. And Zionism, I mentioned, it originates among Christian fundamentalists in the 16th and 17th century, but it originates among a small Jewish minority of the Jewish population in Eastern Europe as a racist, proto-fascist political ideology until the 1930s. And Zionism, now taken up by this Jewish minority, is part of the late 19th century wave of what we call racial nationalism that swept across Europe and beyond Europe in the late 19th century. Racial nationalism argues that every human being belongs to a biologically pure race, that we're all divided into these biological races. And each biological race pertains to and has its ancestral homeland in a particular piece of territory, and that biological race should be exclusive and pure in that particular territory. So the US version of this, of course, is manifest destiny. Anglo-Saxons are a specific biological race that should be in North America, and before that, of course, in the UK. But this Zionist ideology as an ideology of racial nationalism has its exact counterpart in Nazi ideology. Nazi ideology said that there is a pure German people, an Aryan people, they go back to ancient times, and that they should exclusively occupy Germany. That was the Nazi banner, Germany for the Germans. The Zionist banner, Israel for the Jews. And across all of Europe, and again, much of the world, the French version of racial nationalism was Gauls, that the French people are biologically pure people. They go back to ancient time and were known as Gauls. So the project of this racial nationalism was to establish ethnically uniform and exclusive states. And Zionism is one version of racial nationalism. 1897 is the first Zionist Congress. It's convened by Herzl. Herzl, you know, is the father of modern Jewish Zionist thought. He had published a year earlier in 1896 his book, The Jewish State, where he lays out the plan to colonize somewhere in the world and establish a Jewish exclusive state. And Herzl actually says, well, this can be in Argentina if the Argentine government gives us land. And then he goes to the British, and the British say, well, you may be able to get Uganda. But then the rest of the Zionists say, no, we need to settle on Palestine to create this exclusive Jewish state. So now, according to Zionist ideology, the history of Palestine is suspended with the Roman conquest of a Jewish kingdom that existed in that land, and that conquest took place in 70 AD. This is what we call a foundational myth, the allegory of Jewish dispersal and exile for 2,000 years, and what goes together with that is this implanted memory. No, Jews are not a people any more than Christians or Buddhists are a people. Judaism, as well as Christianity, as well as Buddhism, these are faith communities. These are religions. So Judaism was and is a faith community. It is a religion, and Jews do not have a common culture. a common history or a common language, nor a territory they've inhabited for centuries. In fact, prior to modern Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel, you had Jewish communities in what is today Yemen. And those Jews in Yemen spoke Arabic, and they had Arab culture. You had in Iran Persian Jewish communities that spoke Farsi and had Persian culture. You had Slav Jews in Eastern Europe. You have Black African Jews in Ethiopia who have their own language and their own food and their culture and their own history. You have Berber communities that are Jewish Berber communities in what is today Morocco and Algeria, the Atlas Mountains, and so forth and so on. So the Zionist project here starting in the late 1800s is to invent this historical myth of a Jewish people and a Jewish homeland in order, this is crucial, to justify a colonial project. As part of the wave of modern colonialism, this takes off in the late 1800s. So in order to do this, you're going to legitimate this with a project of racial nationalism. Now, there's a direct parallel here with, again, the racial nationalisms which swept Europe, including Nazi racial nationalism. So the Nazis had a myth of a pure Aryan nation going back all the way to Teutonic tribes. The French racial nationalists had a myth of a Gaulish people, pure-blooded Gaulish people. And the Zionist myth here is of an historic Jewish nation that goes back thousands of years and was expelled from their land 2,000 years ago. So in order to claim a state and to colonize, the Zionists must create this myth of a Jewish people exiled and now returning to their original homeland and resuming history. And of course, the flip side of that is you have to dehumanize the Palestinians. You have to erase the Palestinians. You have to remove them from their land, but not just from their land, but from history. And that's the Zionist project. So, and again, this is background for maybe almost all of you. So I'm not going into the background, larger story of the creation of the State of Israel and Zionism and this conflict going back to the late 1800s and really taking off in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. I'm just summarizing some of this so we get to the main part of the talk. But I want to remind you, if you're not familiar with this, and there's so much literature, so much documented history on this, really the best one is Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. But remember that in 1948, Israel is founded literally through mass terrorism, through ethnic cleansing, through massacres that massacred, that killed and injured thousands, tens of thousands, through literally summary executions, through the establishment of concentration camps, and also through, and I'm mentioning this because we'll see why in just a moment, through the confiscation of Palestinians' personal property, just like the Nazis. You know from all of the films we've seen and the historical documents that when Jews were rounded up by the Nazis and sent to concentration camps, their houses were taken over, their furniture, their clothing, everything was just simply appropriated by the Nazis. There was an award, the Oscar-winning film, Zone of Interest, came out, I believe, it won the Oscar last year, 2024. And you see in that film, that really excellent film, this Auschwitz concentration camp. And the commander of that concentration camp is, well, it's in a film, but it's right paralleling the real history. They has his house and his extended family, comfortable, lovely estate, right literally outside the wall of the concentration camp, the Auschwitz concentration camp. And the commander comes home each day having expropriated the Jews brought into the concentration camp with their jackets, their clothing, their jewelry, their personal belonging. He gives it to his wife and they distribute it among their family members. Well, that exactly is what happened in 1948 with the Nakba. Unbelievable description and scenes of the same thing, expelling Palestinians, taking over their houses, their furniture, literally expropriating, taking off the jewelry from Palestinian women, fleeing through the Nakba. So here's the question. The point is, how could it be that Jews who suffered the Holocaust embrace an ideology and a political project that is a close cousin of Nazism and conducive to the genocide, which is now in full throttle now in 2025 as we speak? And here we can turn to Norman Finkelstein, the great Jewish American historian and political scientist. His idea, what he labels the Holocaust industry, how the Zionist project manipulates and weaponizes Jewish grief and suffering and memory of the Holocaust. This is a profound form of trauma manipulation. And the irony here is that Jews are as much a target of this trauma manipulation, as are the Palestinians targets of the Zionist colonization. The strategy of the Zionists is to make Jews feel that, first of all, there's an existential threat out there. Secondly, that you can only protect yourself from that existential threat by blind defense of the state of Israel. Third, you are imposed on you, the Zionist project, a siege mentality. And then fourth, of course, you have to dehumanize the Palestinians or any critics of Zionism as representing that existential threat. So the Zionism's Holocaust industry strategy, it has to be masked by inculcating this psychopathic victimhood complex. But here's the thing, and that's why I said 2023, since then, the global intifada in solidarity with Palestine really represents a turning point. There is a new generation of anti-Zionist Jews, especially young Jews, now leading the struggle here in the United States against the genocide. Jewish Voices for Peace, I believe, is one of the co-sponsors of this event, the American Council for Judaism, if not now, the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, and so forth. So really, in the United States, and really worldwide also, the Jewish support base for the Zionist project is seriously eroded, continues to be eroded. And the Israel-US, and we really can't separate the US from the Zionist project, they're one and the same. US is the sponsor of this genocide, not just supporting it, but sponsoring it. The Israel-US is losing the political war of legitimacy. The Zionists, the state of Israel, cannot be militarily defeated. That's simply not possible, but it is losing the political war for legitimacy. By definition, Zionism is apartheid. And so it should come as no surprise that Israel backed and armed apartheid South Africa. It helped apartheid South Africa to develop nuclear weapons. Only when the African National Congress came to power in 1994 that it dismantled the nuclear weapons program. In 1976, that was the same year of the Soweto Uprising, you'll remember. In the midst of the Soweto Uprising in 1976, Soweto Uprising was the beginning of the end of the South African white minority apartheid regime. That same year, Israel invites the South African Prime Minister, John Vorster, who was organizing the slaughter of Black Africans. And who is Vorster, the Prime Minister of South Africa? He's a former Nazi sympathizer. He was a commander of the fascist Osen Bratwag organization in South Africa, which sided openly with Hitler and makes a state visit to Israel. This shows you the farce of Israel and the Zionists using anti-Semitism to defend itself. So this is the words of former South African Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd in 1961. He explains, the Jews took Israel from the Arabs after the Arabs had lived there for 1,000 years. In that, I agree with them. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. And then fast forward to 1987 on the left of the screen, that is the Israeli general, Raphael Eitan. And he proclaims, this was 7 years before the fall of apartheid in South Africa. He proclaims, whoever says Negroes are being persecuted in South Africa is lying. They are trying to take over the white minority, just like Arabs want to take us over. So with that as the background, again, many of you may be familiar with that background. For others, it was new. But that was the background I wanted to put forward. And then the remainder of the talk, I want to focus on what I'm going to term the political economy of Israeli genocide. Why genocide? Why now? What next? And I'm going to cover these 6 points in what remains of this presentation. So we're going to start the fundamental background to understanding Trumpism, the rise of Trumpism, to understanding fascism rising in the United States, to understand what's going on around the world, including the genocide, the trade wars, everything going on in the world. The fundamental background here is the multi-dimensional crisis of global capitalism. This global capitalist system, which now engulfs the entire planet, is facing an unprecedented crisis. And we don't typically think about linking our solidarity with Palestine or the genocide with this crisis. But that's what we need to do. This will be my one, let us say, theoretical slide. And there's 4 dimensions I want to highlight to this crisis. One is what technically we call an overaccumulation crisis. What that means in simplified terms is chronic stagnation in the global economy. Chronic stagnation, which is a crisis for capital, for the transnational capitalist class. And that chronic stagnation and this overaccumulation crisis, it involves that the transnational capitalist class, this global ruling class, has accumulated enormous amounts of wealth and capital, more than it can reinvest, much less even spend. And so that capital needs to be unloaded. The transnational capitalist class needs to violently open up new space, new frontiers for capital accumulation, for seizing resources and opening up markets. We'll come back to that. That's the first dimension of this global crisis, which is this economic or structural dimension. The second dimension is unprecedented social polarization. 1% of humanity now controls over 50% of the world's wealth. 20% of humanity controls over 95% of the world's wealth. That means 80% of humanity has to make do with just 5% of the world's wealth. So everywhere around the world, we are seeing social disintegration. We are seeing a crisis of what we call social reproduction. Billions of people cannot survive, cannot reproduce themselves from one day, from one year to the next. And this crisis of social reproduction, very much in the United States too, is getting worse and worse. And what's going on here? A big part of this story, also of the genocide, is that surplus capital, which is the first dimension of this crisis, finds its alter ego in surplus labor, in what we can call surplus humanity. Some 2 billion people, and growing very rapidly, have been locked out, marginalized, thrown out of the global economy and society because they're of no use to global capital, to the transnational capitalist class. The digital revolution, now fully underway, is going to rapidly increase the ranks of surplus humanity. And we're going to come back to the significance of all of this for understanding Palestine, and also the general crisis we're facing right here in the United States and the threat of fascism in 2025. The third dimension of this crisis is a political crisis of state legitimacy, of capitalist hegemony, and of geopolitical confrontation. In fact, the turn towards fascism in the United States and elsewhere also is a far-right response to this crisis. And part of that response is to invent scapegoats, to channel mass discontent and frustration and this crisis of survival for so many people towards scapegoats, to channel it in a different direction. That's part of the persecution of immigrants, part of the story, but not the whole story. And then finally, this is a crisis of the planetary ecosystem. Very simply, the endless accumulation of capital is running up against the finite limits to the biosphere, which makes this crisis of global capitalism truly existential. So, as I wrote in a recent article, so I'm quoting myself here, Palestine shows us both the past and the future, a redux of the dark history of European colonialism that reached its zenith in the 19th and 20th centuries, and also a ghastly glimpse into the future of a global capitalism whose extermination impulse is rising to the surface in the face of unprecedented crisis. So here you get an idea of what I mean by the global meaning of Gaza. We put a mirror up to Gaza and we see all of humanity reflected in Gaza. So the first of those 6 points now, will be including with these 6 points. Israel is facing what it considers a demographic crisis. This is the Zionist version of what we have in the United States known as replacement theory. Israel is a self-declared Jewish state. And in that context, Jews must be a majority. The only problem is, in recent years, you have continued out-migration and very little in-migration of Jews, and the Palestinian birth rate is higher than the Jewish birth rates. The last major influx of Jews, in-migration of Jews, was when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992. 1 million Jews went into Israel. Since then, there's been more out-migration than in-migration, so the demographic crisis for the Zionist project is deepening. That is why, by the way, on 7 November 2024, just late last year, Israel passes a law to deport Arab citizens of Israel if their relatives are so-called terrorists. So if you have a so-called terrorist in the West Bank or in Gaza or anywhere in the world, you're now, as an Israeli citizen, remember 20% of Israeli citizens inside the formal borders of Israel are Palestinians. You can now be deported. So this is part of all of this repression to try and resolve this demographic crisis. So each time Palestinians have threatened to be a majority, we've seen a new round of ethnic cleansing, intensified repression, and occupation. And I'm talking about before October 7 of 2023. Okay, so that is why you have this demographic pressures contributing to the far-right fascist government in Israel, desperate to so-called resolve the Palestinian problem. That is why before October of 2023, we had a radical escalation of settlements in the West Bank, attacks on Palestinians, and a buildup of genocidal pressure. This is simply accelerated. That's why I said this is a precipitating event is October 7th of 2023. So this is Bethlehem. On the left top, you see Palestinians being expelled by Zionists. That's part of the Nakba. On the right-hand side, you see the original refugee camp in Bethlehem in the West Bank. And on the bottom left, you see me taking that photo. I visited the West Bank and Gaza in 2015. And I took that photo in the same refugee camp, now being occupied, well, by some of the older people originally expelled from Palestine, from their homeland, but also by their children and grandchildren in that refugee camp that's still there. Now, if you look at the top of my screen here, you see what I'm asserting, that the Jewish state would collapse if refugees were returned. The refugees which were expelled from their land and confiscated in 1948, if they returned, that would be the collapse of the Zionist project. And you may not know, or some of you probably do, that the United Nations Resolution 194 was passed in 1948 and declared that all of those that had been violently expelled from their land and expropriated in 1948 have a right by international law to return and to reclaim what was confiscated from them. That resolution was not just passed in 1948, but reiterated and passed again every single year since then, right up until the last United Nations General Assembly in September of last year. And so that is why also the Zionists have tried to smash, and have succeeded in Gaza in smashing the UNRWA. The UNRWA is the UN branch set up in 1948 to attend to the refugees that had been expelled from their lands and confiscated, and considering them to still be refugees from that expulsion in 1948. That's why Israel and the United States hates UNRWA. Now, those figures there are 7, 7, and 6. There are 7 million Jews in Greater Palestine, in historic Palestine. There are 7 million Palestinians in historic Palestine, between those living in the borders of the state of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And there are 6 million Palestinians in the diaspora. So you see that demographic threat to a Jewish exclusive apartheid state. And so this explains the expanding Israeli colonialism in the occupied territories. And it explains the escalation of settler and IDF, again, IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, terrorism being escalated constantly. This is a prelude to a new round of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. While genocide's going on in Gaza, there is a radical escalation of violence and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. So Israel was just looking for an excuse to launch genocide. The October 7, 2023 events was the precipitating events that gave it the excuse. So the second of these 6 concluding points. The Palestinian proletariat is surplus humanity. I've spoken in more general terms about the expansion of the ranks of surplus humanity simply standing in the way of global capitalism, with of no use to the transnational capitalist class and the ruling classes. And so we've seen this radical worldwide expansion of surplus humanity. That figure of 2 billion, by the way, comes from the International Labor Organization. And wherever we see borders where surplus humanity is trying to find a way to survive. For instance, the US-Mexico border, these become zones of death. They become images of what's going on and what's continue to deepen and spread worldwide. Just like holding up a mirror to Palestine, to Gaza right now, shows us the future of all of humanity if we don't fight back. Holding up a mirror to the Mediterranean area, holding up a mirror to the US-Mexico border, shows us all of humanity and the struggle and the possible future we face without our fight back. So along the US-Mexico border in recent years, 7,000 people have died, but those are only the bodies that have been found and identified with name, first and last name, 7,000. These are the killing fields of this new global capitalist system in crisis. Thousands more have died in the desert, never recovered. Thousands more, we don't know how many, have died making that dangerous trek through Central America and through Mexico. The Mediterranean, with refugees trying to get to Europe, again, not because they love Europe, because that's a mechanism for survival. From North Africa and from the Middle East, 24,500 have died in recent years. And again, those are only the bodies that we been recovered and identified. But this is worldwide. It's not just Western Europe and the United States against the global South. That image is false. It's very misleading for reasons I'll go into in a little bit of detail in just a moment. So Saudi Arabia, the majority of people in Saudi Arabia are transnational migrant workers who have no citizenship rights, no political, no civil rights whatsoever. They're simply there to work, and they have to leave Saudi Arabia when their work, then when they no longer are contributing their labor. So as part of that, there's 750,000 Ethiopian Africans in Saudi Arabia working now. In 2024, some of you may remember these headlines. Several hundreds of Ethiopian migrants were making their way from Yemen into Saudi Arabia through the mountain zone, virtually barefoot, impoverished people, no weapons, nothing like that. They're detected by Saudi border guard that open up fire with automatic weapons and kill several hundred of them. That made headlines in 2024. But again, here you're seeing where surplus humanity meets those that control global power and global wealth, you get the killing fields. You get that reflection of where we are headed if we don't change direction. So that's why I said global capitalism, its extermination impulse is now rising to the surface with this global crisis. And in some cases, such as that of Palestine, this extermination impulse has an ethnic dimension. So I'm a sociologist. In radical sociology, we identify two structures of ethnic oppression. The first is what we call disorganization of the working class and super exploitation of one segment. So you have an entire working class being exploited by capital, but one sector is ethnically demarcated and subject to special controls and more intense exploitation. So historically, after slavery, and up until the civil rights movement, that has been, for instance, Black people in the United States. They're part of the proletariat after the Civil War, but their special racist controls means they're super exploited and super controlled. And of course, that is the exact situation right now with transnational migrant workers in the United States. You have the working class in the United States divided between citizen and immigrant labor is subject to special controls because you don't have citizenship, you don't have your political rights, you can't vote, you can't fight for your labor rights because you'll be deported. And so you have that structure of that racist structure, that structure of ethnic oppression in the United States. Then the second structure we have is exclusion. And this is where the ruling groups do not need the labor of the ethnically oppressed group. They only need the resources of that group. So that's the situation with Native Americans or indigenous in North America. Their land was needed, but not their labor because you had African slave labor and European immigrant labor. And so subject to genocide. Now that is the situation now with Palestinians in Gaza. Their labor is not needed. Their bodies are not needed. Their bodies, their labor, they're just standing in the way of getting global capitalism, getting at the resources in Gaza. No, I'm going to take one step back here and say that is the situation now, but we have an historic tension between 1948 and the early 2000s in Israel, in Palestine. And that tension is, on the one hand, the Zionist project is to expropriate the Palestinians and exclude them through ethnic cleansing and now through genocide. That's one side of this dialectic. The other side of the Zionist project was, yes, to expropriate them, but then to super exploit Palestinian labor, which is why from 1948 right up to date, but less and less and less and less, you have Palestinians working in Israeli agricultural plantations, in Israeli construction sites, in factories, in the care industry, and so forth. So that's always been a tension. The Zionists have always said, should we expropriate them and simply get rid of them, or should we expropriate them, but also super exploit their labor? And then Israel decided in the late 1990s, intensifying as we speak, especially 1983, the closure policy, the West Bank is closed off. It's decided to go with the latter, the former, expropriation and exclusion. And so at that point, Israel starts to import transnational migrant labor, just like the United States draws it in, just like Saudi Arabia draws in transnational migrant labor. Israel turns to replacing Palestinian cheap exploited controlled labor with transnational migrant labor, recruited from as far away as the Philippines, China, India, Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, Kenya, Eastern Europe, and Pakistan, and many other places. And that's why, by the way, with the Hamas attack of October 7th of 2023, they also took as hostages Filipino workers, Thais, Nepalese, and others. And after the Hamas attack, the last remaining 10,000 Palestinian Gazans from Palestinians from Gaza were sent back to Gaza. There are no Gazans now that are needed for the Israeli economy, so they can be completely genocided. And again, I want to mention that this is part of a more general phenomenon of the whole world capitalist system, increasingly using transnational migrant labor. MENA stands for Middle East and North Africa. 50 to 90% of the workforce in the general MENA region is transnational migrant labor. And so now the Gaza option of genocide of surplus humanity, as I said here, Gaza becomes a real-time alarm bell. That genocide is a political tool for resolving ruling class problems of surplus humanity. And what happens to Palestine then is what happens to humanity. That, again, we are getting to the global meaning of Gaza. So Gaza has been, as you know, in the occupied territories, a giant supermax prison for surplus humanity. So on the left, this was a photo from 2024. You see Palestinian men being rounded up, stripped to their underwear, placed in that position, and from there they're taken off to concentration camps, to jails, and you never hear from them again. And so that's the blending of the supermax prison with outright genocide. On the right-hand side, in the last month or so, now everyone's familiar with that image. But this image, we've been familiar since it opened up in March of 2023. That's in El Salvador. That's the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism. It's a supermax prison for holding 40,000 people. And so that is the other side of how the ruling groups can deal with and control and contain surplus humanity and their potential and real rebellion. So the ruling groups face these two choices of what they can do to confront surplus humanity: the Gaza option of outright genocide, or the Salvadoran option of mega imprisonment. And we're seeing the worldwide spread of supermax prisons. After the Salvadoran prison opened, Brazil, China, Turkey, Thailand, Philippines, India, other countries all announced plans to build similar giant supermax prisons. The image you're seeing there is of Turkey. And I don't remember if it's Thailand or Sri Lanka, but one of those announced that their supermax prison would hold 60,000 prisoners. So imagine that. All of the personnel needed to run 60,000 prisoners. You're talking about literally constructing a city of supermax imprisonment. This is the new mega imprisonment geographies of global capitalism in crisis. So that's the second. The third of these three concluding analytical points is we can understand the genocide against Palestinians in the context of what I term in my book there, The Global Police State, militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. And here is where we need to go back again to the crisis of global capitalism and see GPS stands for Global Police State. How systems of warfare, of social control, and of repression have become fundamental to global capitalist accumulation. They're central to the whole global economy. We're living in a global war economy, repressing whole populations, setting up whole systems of surveillance and social control, sparking small conflicts and large conflicts and whole outright wars are enormously profitable, and they save the global economy from collapsing even faster than it's already collapsing. And it happens to be that Israel is at the very heart of this global military industrial surveillance homeland security complex. Israel is a totally militarized economy. It's the pioneer of so-called homeland security industry, supplying the whole world, including the United States. So the point is that repression of Palestinians is big business. You may know that new weapon systems are tested in the occupied territories before they're exported to the rest of the world. And the Israeli political economy thrives on war and thrives on conflict. And this, it should come as no surprise then that Israel gives crucial support to far-right fascist and military and even military dictatorships all around the world. Israel has plenty of experience outside of its own borders with genocide. It supervised and advised the Guatemalan army in genocide in the 1980s against the Mayan indigenous. Again, it backed and armed and even gave nuclear weapons to apartheid South Africa. This should come as no surprise because, one, it is an apartheid state, a racist colonial apartheid state, supporting these apartheid and colonial and racist systems around the world, but also because it needs and thrives on this type of conflict and repression and even genocide. This is also why, by the way, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, one spokesperson for the U.S. military-industrial complex said, after that invasion, looked at it and said, happy days are here again, because that represents big time profit and capitalist accumulation in that tragic war between Russia and Ukraine. And this is why an executive from Morgan Stanley declared right after Israel launched its genocide in October, late October of 2023, that the Gaza war is, quote, an actual quote, good for our portfolio. And so part of the story here of what's going on is the distinction between wars within nations and between nations is ever less meaningful. The genocide against Gaza is a global capitalist genocide being carried out by the United States and by Israel as the direct agents of genocide. And as the global economy stagnates, genocide becomes enormously profitable and attractive for the ruling groups. It resolves political and economic problems for these ruling groups. And I conclude this slide by saying globalization of the late Victorian Holocausts. Maybe one or maybe a few of you have heard of that book. It was written by Mike Davis. I think about 10, 12 years ago came out. Late Victorian Holocausts was the title of it. And it referred to how when the British had colonized India, and then the British would take all of the wealth, agricultural wealth, it took over the agricultural lands, it would export all of the wealth from India, including the export crops that they set up, and ship it to the world market for profit. That was what British colonialism was all about. And so every time there was the slightest drought, the slightest natural disaster, it would lead to massive famines and mass deaths, to millions of Indians dying constantly. That's what Mike Davis referred to as late Victorian Holocausts. So now we are seeing around the world these late Victorian Holocausts. So to reiterate, social control, repression, warfare, genocide become enormously profitable and politically useful for Israel, which becomes for the ruling groups, and Israel becomes a model for the global police state. By the way, the Israeli police and military train US police. And we get to what I'm going to refer to in just a minute as global green zoning, whether it's in the city I live in, Los Angeles, or whether it's, or where you are in Oregon, or whether it's in Palestine. So that's me on the left, and I'm in Hebron, and I'm leaving the Palestine area and entering where the settlers have their exclusive settler zone. And that image right there you see worldwide, that's the image of the global fortress. Now, the green zones protected through all of these digital and real physical barriers and protected by the global police state. And inside is the privileged select few of humanity. And then inside the settler area where I went into, I took that photo, and this is settler graffiti. Gas the Arabs. And this is 2015, way before October of 2023. So what you're seeing at the top left, that is not Gaza. That is a fake city constructed by the Israeli Defense Forces, by the Israeli military in the Negev Desert, in official Israeli territory. And they modeled it after Gaza City so that the Israeli military could practice genocide, could practice control of the Gaza population, could practice ethnic cleansing, etc., before they actually started doing it in Gaza, which is now underway. So that's Little Gaza. That's what they called it, the Israelis, Little Gaza, that they built in the Negev Desert. And so you may have heard of Cop City outside of Atlanta, where police are trained as basically paramilitary units in urban counterinsurgency and mass repression. So Cop City in Atlanta, and there's been a big movement against Cop City, is modeled after Little Gaza. And it should come as no surprise that the Israeli military trains US police. And so there have been, as part of Cop City being established in Atlanta, 300 so-called anti-terrorism laws introduced at state legislatures, at the level of states in the United States. 42 have been approved in 21 states, and then that legislation has been used to repress Palestine solidarity. So we get this. I keep coming back to, this is the global meaning of Gaza. What is taking place in Gaza? This genocide is reflecting what's going on all over the world and what we all are or going to be facing. So we have these new global geographies of containment. It's what I call global green zoning. And let me explain where that term green zone comes from. The map you're seeing here, the satellite image you're seeing there is of Baghdad, and this was after the invasion, the U.S. invasion in 2023, the invasion and prolonged occupation of Iraq. So the invaders set up the green zone that you can see there, and they made blast bulletproof barriers all around the green zone. No one could get in, no one get out unless you go through massive military checkpoints and everything. And inside the green zone, you have the US military officers, you have the corporate elite executives from all over the world invited to now invest in the post-invasion Iraq. You have the new Iraqi political and economic elite inside the green zone. They're protected by the US military canopy. And outside the green zone, there's war and devastation and mass death and destruction everywhere. And so the whole world is becoming green zoned and gray zoned, or green zones and war zones. And the global police state, that's GPS, is active both inside the green zone to protect those inside the green zone from all of humanity outside. And the global police state is active outside in those gray zones or those war zones, repressing, surveilling, controlling, murdering, genociding, etc. So here you see the green zones and the gray zones. And so that image you're seeing of the swimming pool and the condominiums being constructed in the center, and I don't have images there, but of super elite malls, air-conditioned malls and so forth, that's all constructed in the green zones. And right next to those green zones, look at that death and destruction. Those are not scenes of Gaza. Those are scenes of Baghdad. On the top left, on the bottom left, and on the top right and bottom right, you see the actual dividing line between the green zones and the gray zones. So that is the green zoning of global society, global capitalist society. That's the fortress world we are moving into all over. That's the global police state standing between the masses outside of the green zones and the privileged few on the inside of the green zones. And again, Palestine is the model. This is the global meaning of Palestine. One little comment, that's glistening city inside the green zone in this cartoon image here. Of course, inside the green zone, there are impoverished, semi-enslaved, virtually enslaved people that, of course, do the service work and everything, but you're tightly controlled by the global police state inside the fortress, as well as kept from entering the fortress outside. And of course, that wall that you're looking there could be the US-Mexico border, the Mediterranean, the Saudi border with Yemen, etc. So part of this is unprecedented use of technology for mass surveillance and control. Every single one of us on the planet is now in the digital base. And is identified and controlled, and facial recognition and panoptical global surveillance is now all over. This is part of new digitalized modalities of mass social control, and they are extremely advanced in the occupied Palestinian territories. And by the way, you're seeing the face of people from China, and I don't know what city of China, because China is not only the leader in facial recognition technology and supplies that technology to the United States, but also supplied that technology to Israel for use in the West Bank. Okay, we're going to come back just a minute to this, the idea that this genocide is just the West. Yes, the West is leading it and sponsoring it. We're not going to ignore real empirical world realities of global capitalism in crisis and ruling roof projects. So you see that quote below. When you guys were in your encampments, when my students at UC Santa Barbara were in their encampments, they received a text, a mass tweet, but from Mossad. Mossad, you may know, is the Israeli CIA, with its hands all over repression and control in the United States, including the Israel lobby organizations. And Mossad sent this tweet. So if you didn't check your tweets, you may not have been aware of it, but it's right there in your tweets if you participated in those encampments. The tweet said, facial recognition can determine whether you participated in pro-Hamas protests at universities. Your jobs and your degrees will be worthless. Your hiring opportunities will be limited. So there is the threat from the fascist Israeli state, from Mossad, and the emerging fascist US state is carrying out that threat now. Like I said, Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voices for Peace, all those against the genocide, we need to remain strong. We need not to be intimidated by this. Gaza, the attacks on Gaza, on Lebanon and on Lebanon also, is the first artificial intelligence war of the 21st century. Just like in the United States, in Israel, the private high-tech, global high-tech corporations are fused in with the Israeli state. Google, intimately tied to the US state, Pentagon and Homeland Security contracts, providing the technology for the US emerging fascist state and the US military, the exact same thing in Israel. And this represents tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in profit. So the name of the game is genocide, repression, control, and profit making through that, by that, because of that. And so the Israeli war machine has been using three AI technologies in its genocide against Gaza. They're called Lavender, Gospel, and Where's Daddy? Gospel targets buildings and structures, not individuals. Now, I want to say something. Just yesterday, absolutely horrific. 91 people were killed in one of the last remaining restaurants. There were women and children and old people sitting in a restaurant in Gaza yesterday, eating in this restaurant, and this exact gospel targeted the AI drone, targeted their restaurant where they're sitting and trying to have a meal. 91 of them, bloodstains all over the street. If you watched Al Jazeera, you would have seen it. They had a coverage within 5 minutes of it happening, and I happened to be watching Al Jazeera at the time. So this nightmare is also the nightmare of the ruling groups controlling AI. Lavender involves machine learning, creating mass database of AI selected targets, and Where's Daddy tracks through mobile phones. This is a step up from Pegasus that you might be familiar with. As one Israeli military spokesperson put it, it's really like a data-driven mass assassination factory. Once you go automatic, target generation goes crazy. So genocide becomes ghastly efficient. Now, I put a Nazi comparison here. There was a really powerful, it really shook me to watch it. And it was in German with English subtitles. This was a docudrama that came out about 6, 7, 8 years ago. And what it was, and this is real history, is sometime, and I don't know the exact year, so don't quote me on it, maybe 1941, 1942, the top Nazi high commands, military and political high command, everyone except Hitler himself was there, went to a weekend retreat on this castle, this mansion castle somewhere, I think outside of Berlin. And there was a stenographer that took detailed notes. So the actual notes become the real dialogue, the real script for this docudrama that came out again in German. And so they're discussing for 2 days straight, how are they going to, quote unquote, resolve the Jewish problem? And if you listen to it, again, I watched it as a nightmarish docudrama to watch because it's their actual words. And they're talking about all the most efficient ways to mass genocide the Jews. And they talk about, well, we could do this, we could do that, that will kill them more effectively. We'll get more of them killed all at once. And at the end, they agree on the solution of the gas chamber. So absolutely chilling, ghastly efficient. And so now you have this AI in Gaza being ghastly efficient, again, with this parallel with the Nazi Holocaust. And to go back and continue to quote the Israeli military spokesperson, even if an attack is averted, you don't care. You immediately move on to the next target. Because of the system, the targets never end. You have another 36,000 waiting, 36,000 targets, that is. So the Israeli genocide is a warfare testing ground and practice one for capitalist states around the world. And one White House spokesperson says regarding Lavender and Gospel, other states are going to be watching and learning. So once again, the global meaning of Gaza, Israel is saying, here is 21st century artificial intelligence warfare. This is what's coming already here for the rest of the world. Fourth of these 6 concluding points, and this is why we needed to look at the global crisis of global capitalism, that because of chronic stagnation and because the transnational capitalist class with all of this accumulated, overaccumulated wealth needs to unload that wealth and open up new spaces for global accumulation, new profit-making opportunities, seize new resources, grab new territories. So this global capitalism in crisis, there builds up enormous pressures for violent capitalist expansion throughout the Middle East and throughout the world. It's in this context that genocide becomes a mechanism of primitive accumulation. The limits to expansion must be overcome by technologies of death and destruction. So the context here is that capitalist globalization sweeps the Middle East starting in the late 1990s, really takes off after the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, which opens up the whole of Middle East to accelerated capitalist globalization. So if we step back just a moment, we can say the post-World War II period of world capitalist expansion targeted the Middle East because especially the centrality of oil to world capitalism, talking about post-World War II into the 1970s, 1980s. And that is when Israel, the Zionist project for creating a Zionist Jewish exclusive state, coincides with and gives a gift to world capitalism in its period of post-World War II expansion by saying we as Israel will be a platform for capitalist expansion throughout the Middle East. So that is how Israel becomes the staging point. And that is why Biden in 1986 said, if there were no Israel, we would have to invent one. And that is for RFK Jr., who ran for president in 2024. Now he's the Secretary of Health and Human Services. That's why he said during his 2024 electoral campaign, it's wonderful to have Israel. It's like we have a aircraft carrier permanently stationed in the Middle East. So, but when we get to the 1980s, 1990s, and now the 21st century, the notion of framing the conflict here as an Israel-Arab conflict is a total anachronism. That was true for the 1948 to 1967 period, a time when there was decolonization, when there was Arab nationalism and Arab socialism on the rise. The 1970s is the last major crisis of world capitalism that brings about financialization, and a new stage in global capitalism leads to globalization in the 1980s and on, and the rise of a transnational capitalist class. And what do we have in the Middle East and North Africa? We have transnational capitalist class formation, which involves not just Western capitalists coming into the Middle East, but Middle Eastern capitalists, powerful capitalist groups and conglomerates fusing with Western capital, fusing with global capital, and expanding itself throughout the Middle East. And so you have intensified transnational corporate and financial investment in energy, tourism, high-tech construction, infrastructure, finance, luxury consumption, and you have the major role for the Arab sovereign wealth, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. And so these are globalized circuits of accumulation pulsing through the Middle East and needing that genocide to expand. And so, yes, the Western countries are the leading edge of backing and sponsoring that genocide. But if we just frame this as Western imperialism against Palestine, we are missing the point. That becomes empty rhetoric by a false leftist understanding of what is going on here. The transnational capitalist class, global capitalism, needs to violently crack open new spaces for this expansion. I will conclude this point now. That common transnational capitalist class interests trump, no pun intended there, a small t, trump political considerations. Maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe the rulers of Saudi Arabia, maybe the rulers of the United Arab Emirates, maybe the rulers of Bahrain, etc. Maybe they don't like to see Palestinians genocided, but they have common class interests with the Israeli capitalist class and the elite, with Western and with global capitalist, transnational capitalist class. And they are facing their own working masses and their own poor masses that do identify with the Palestinians, and the Arab political and economic elites fear that their own working class masses will rise up in solidarity with Palestine. So Palestine is simply a thorn in the side for the Arab ruling classes. Egypt signed its peace accord and full diplomatic relations with Israel in 1980. Jordan did so in 1994. The Abraham Accords involved that same normalization of relationships and massive investment by the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and I believe the other one was I forgot where the World Cup was held, in the Abraham Accords. And then on the eve of October 7 of 2023, Saudi Arabia, Israel were on set to normalize their relations, meaning that would open up the spigot for massive transnational corporate, including Arab capitalist investment in Israel and Israeli expansion of Israeli-based capital into the whole of the Middle East, which is already there. Already you have tens of thousands of tourists going to the United Arab Emirates, to Dubai, to the hotels, and so forth. So the normalization of Saudi Arabia and Israel, their normalization is supposed to not just be an economic normalization, but was intended to cement the region-wide oppressive political and social order. That normalization was put on hold by the Hamas attack of 7 October of 2023, and it is now being revived and discussed again, and Trump is trying to promote that. He's just going right now to a visit to the Middle East, and that's really the centerpiece of his whole visit. And so that's the leading edge of transnational capital in the Middle East. Gulf capital, I want to reiterate this, talking about trillions of dollars in sovereign funds. They have fused that Gulf capital with global capital from all over the world, including from China, from India, from Brazil, from the United States, from Western Europe, and that all massively invested in the Middle East. China is now the region's principal trading partner and a major investor in Israel and in the whole region. So yes, Western-based capital is there. It's, again, sponsoring the genocide, but it's fused with the other transnational capitals that are there. Middle East Asia corridor is now a major conduit for global capital. So more than old-fashioned settler colonialism, we're seeing the barbarous face of the global capitalist system that can only reproduce itself through bloodshed, dehumanization, torture, and extermination. And so we get everyone saying, or many people saying, the BRICS are a friend of Palestinian liberation. BRICS, stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now there's new members, including Egypt, including Saudi Arabia itself, including the United Arab Emirates. And so, really? Russia is the number one supplier of coal to Israel. South Africa is the number two supplier. Brazil supplies 9% of Israel's oil. India provides military equipment to Israel for Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon. Israel's main port terminal in Haifa was privatized to the Shanghai International Port Group, and that's where weapons are unloaded that go to the genocide. China-Israeli trade hit a record high of $20 billion. Depending on what data you use, China is the number one or the number two trade partner of Israel. South Africa's leading arms dealer, Ivor Ichikowitz, who's tied to the African National Congress, a financier of the African National Congress, operates military joint ventures with Elbit Systems, which is the largest Israeli military industrial corporation. So this may explain why no BRICS, although they give diplomatic condemnation to the genocide, none of them have imposed economic sanctions in Israel or cut diplomatic ties. While the principal blame lays with the United States, there's no doubt about that. If China were to impose an economic boycott or cut diplomatic ties with Israel, that genocide would crumble right away. Israel would have lost its main trading partner. Uh-oh. Something happened. Give me a moment. There we go. So we are seeing, this is scenes of the Ukraine war. So these are transnational conflicts. They're not nation-state conflicts. We're seeing escalating geopolitical confrontation. These are wars over resources, over profit-making, over state competition, response to capitalist crisis and collapse, wars to contain mass revolts from below. And what we're seeing is that whole regions, whole states are collapsing. Haiti, the Congo, Sudan, and we're seeing in parts of the Mexican, the Colombian countryside, all around the world, we're seeing the rise of new political and military mafias exercising quasi-state powers and fusing with these repressive states. We're seeing cartels, criminal gangs, corrupt cliques in consort with transnational capital. Remember, look at that ugly scenes of this horrible warfare between Russia and Ukraine, and yet happy days are here again for the transnational capitalist class that now can not only sell its weapons to Ukraine, but will get at the rare earth minerals. This is the scenes from the Congo, and the eastern and central Congo, a place of unbelievable mineral resources for the global economy, desperately needed. And you see all these paramilitary groups supplied by the transnational capitalist class and states around the world. These are, again, transnational wars by global capitalists and states to seize resources. Now we can understand this map that Netanyahu held up to the United Nations on 22 September of 2023, what he said is the new Middle East, to create these new trade routes from India right through and to the northern part of Gaza. And only problem is that the Palestinians in Gaza stand in the way of transnational capitalist expansion. Transnational capital accumulation through genocide is supposed to be followed now by a new round of extractive industrial, financial, and commercial investments, whether you want to call it Trump's Riviera in the Middle East or an outlet for getting at incredible resources, including gas and oil and real estate and a new canal project. And Zionist project is key to this global capitalist expansion, not just in Gaza, but throughout the Middle East. And again, Palestinians, a surplus humanity, standing in the way of major capitalist expansion in this region. Israel and the United States are now calling for the expulsion of all Gazans from Palestine. And we're seeing the Gazanization of the West Bank that's already underway. I started this talk, I'm just about done with it. I started this talk by saying you all know that the genocide has now been resumed, that the Israeli military is reoccupying all of Gaza, and that there's mass starvation. Well, that was resumed on February 20, 2025. And the day before, you see this flyer that's in Arabic. You see Netanyahu and you see Trump. The day before this flyer was dropped massively on Gaza. That's the actual flyer that was dropped on Gaza. Trump said the Palestinians have to leave Gaza. We're going to make that the Riviera of the Middle East. And this is what the flyer said. To the honorable people of Gaza, after the events that have taken place, the temporary ceasefire, and before the implementation of Trump's mandatory plan, which will impose forced discipline upon you, whether you accept it or not, we have decided to make one final appeal to those who wish to receive aid in exchange for cooperating with us. We will not hesitate for a moment to provide assistance. Reconsider your position. The world map will not change if all the people of Gaza cease to exist. No one will feel for you. No one will ask about you. You have been left alone to face your inevitable fate. Iran cannot even protect itself, let alone protect you, and you have seen with your own eyes what has happened. Neither America nor Europe care about Gaza in any way. Even your Arab countries, which are now our allies, provide us with money and weapons while sending you only shrouds. There is little time left. The game is almost over. Whoever wishes to say themselves before it is too late, we are here, remaining until the end. So the words the words opening the new round of genocide. So I conclude, we're facing here in the United States an unprecedented crackdown. Why? Because we've also seen an unprecedented upsurge of Palestine solidarity. The Zionist narrative is cracking. US policy is being threatened. Israel and the United States, as I mentioned previously, control the military battlefield, but they've already lost the battle for political legitimacy. Those of us on our campuses, whether you guys in the University of Oregon or me here at the University of California, our universities are ground zero for Palestine solidarity. Our university administrators are not acting alone. The Israeli, the US state, the transnational capitalist class, they are organizing this repression. Our universities are the brain trust for the military industrial complex, for tech capital, for finance capital. Our universities now are driven, one, by tuition, and secondly, by massive corporate and private donors. And Israel has donated nearly $400 million to these university endowments. Those endowments are major outlets for accumulating and investing capital all around the world, in turn invested in Israel and throughout the Middle East and North Africa. That is why our call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is such a threat. That is why yesterday the US Congress debated making boycott, divestment, sanctions a felony, to advocate it. And I advocate for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. US policy towards the whole MENA region hinges on propping up Zionist Israel, and the mass protest movement in the United States and around the world is a threat to this project. Palestine solidarity has to be criminalized. Note that because this is a war by the transnational capitalist class against the people of the Palestinian people, against the global working class, against us. The transnational capitalist class, not just the states. So please take note that everyone knows about Palantir, because Palantir's Peter Thiel has put into place the Vice President, J.D. Vance, as his agent in the U.S. state. And because Palantir is now working closely with the Trump regime as we move towards the construction of a fascist corporate project. But Palantir was already repressing us on our campuses. In January 2024, Palantir agreed to a strategic partnership with the Israeli Ministry of Defense to supply the technology to the IDF, that tech technology which we discussed earlier. And then the Palantir CEO, Alex Karp, was interviewed, and he said, with regard to our encampments, we think college campus protests are a sideshow. No, they are the show. If we lose the intellectual battle, we will not be able to deploy any army in the West ever. So that is what we are up against. In concluding, without time to go into detail, I started by saying that the persecution of immigrants is part of the attack on the entire U.S. and the global working class, with immigrant workers being the front lines. And so you may look at this incredible repression against immigrants and say it's arbitrary. They're rounding up anyone and racially profiling. Sure, they're racially profiling, but that's not the point. The main point is you would never know that they're quite selective in who they are arresting. They are arresting union members, immigrant union members, and labor organizers. The most obvious ones that you're familiar with is Lelo Juarez, he's in Washington, one state over from you, a labor organizing, or immigrant activist Jeanette Vizguerra. But you may not know that, I forgot his first name, but Garcia, who is now rotting in the Salvadoran gulag, sent there by the United States, he was not only a union member, but he was being trained by his union to increase his skill set. So they're going after the organized sector of the immigrant part of the working class. That's why the war on migrant workers war on the entire multi-ethnic, multinational working class. Wars on unions, on women and reproductive rights, on the trans community, on the environmental movement, on social security and education, on healthcare. All of this is connected. All of this involves violent, predatory class warfare from above by the transnational capitalist oligarchy, and that is the context for Palestine also. Now, you may be shocked by this image you're seeing here. You won't know what it is. So that is the Dominican Republic. You may not know that Haitian migrants, because they share the same island, Hispaniola, Haitian migrants in Dominican Republic, the western side of that island, are extremely repressed and oppressed ethnically. They form the cheapest of the workforce, cutting down the sugarcane and the sugarcane plantations, and they're being subject, as we speak, to pogroms and to ethnic cleansing. And so this is a pogrom being initiated just a couple weeks ago in the Dominican Republic against Haitian migrants. And why are they waving the Israeli flag? Now you see it, because that flag now symbolizes fascist forces all around the world. They turn to Israel, to Zionist project, as the beacon of how they're going to organize and carrying out fascist projects. So war against Palestine is war against the people. The current wave of repression, we're experiencing it, radical violence and predatory class warfare from above, the brutality of this war on immigrants, including warrantless raids, illegal abduction, disappearances, suspension of habeas corpus, that's intended as a potent spectacle of power of the state and a more general warning that political dissent and class struggle from below will not be tolerated. We're seeing the breakdown of the rule of law, authoritarianism, and fascism rising to the surface, a project to dismantle the regulatory and social welfare state and replace it with the global police state. And we're seeing spineless complicity of university administrators. So I conclude by saying no one is safe if we're not all safe. We must protect and defend each other across different communities and struggles and unite the entire working class. And so Palestine is the symbol of popular rage and global intifada against the global capitalist status quo. It's a symbol for the crisis of humanity, with the stakes being extremely high. So I stop. Trying to have myself see you. Can you see me?
Yep.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. We have like 15 minutes for questions if people would like to ask questions.
Hi, Professor. My name is Blaze. I am a student organizer here at the University of Oregon. Sorry. I'm a student organizer here, and we find ourselves within the context of a student worker strike. We have organized and built a union over the course of the last 3 years. It's been a really long project of ours. And within this context, I kind of wanted to ask how, with the overall depoliticization and even kind of right-wing movement that we're seeing with a lot of modern day unions, how do we as left-wing union organizers combat this and fight against the fascist regime?
Yeah, thank you, Blaze. A great question. So there's two things going on. One is that, and good for you that you're organizing as a student worker union. And we need to all start thinking ourselves as workers. Some of us are more privileged workers with more secure employment, but that's changing very rapidly. Others might be getting, you guys might be getting degrees, but you'll go out into a job market where you find your precarious labor replaced by artificial intelligence. We need to start thinking of us in the academy as academic workers, as student workers, as academic workers, and start thinking in terms of building class consciousness, class struggle, class-based organizations. So great that you formed a student worker organization, and more power to you in your strike. But that's the first thing. The other thing is, this is not a new history in which the leadership of the unions, and unfortunately only 15% of workers in the United States are unionized. That needs to change, and it is changing. But it's the leadership of the unions is reactionary. The leadership of the unions has always lined up behind U.S. foreign policy, and the leadership of unions, and this is not new. I mean, it's the same thing in Mexico. It's the same thing in many places around the world. The leadership of the unions is more concerned with controlling the mass base of the unions and of the working class than it is of confronting capital. But there's a contradiction in that, and that is that the U.S. working class, it doesn't matter whether members of the working class voted for Trump, voted for Biden, or simply opted to not vote at all, which was the biggest vote, was the non-vote in this past election. The entire working class is facing complete destabilization, downward mobility, and rising mass discontent. The Trump base within the working class, which is, by the way, not just white, it's multi-ethnic, although disproportionately white, that's eroding very quickly because this fascist project is it's trying to pulverize salaries. It's trying to dismantle and is dismantling all regulations. It's going after Social Security and Medicare and any social safety net. It's criminalizing unions. And so very quickly, the conditions for the development of class-based organizing and class consciousness is rising to the surface, and we have to push that forward. And we are in solidarity with Palestine if we do two things simultaneously. We can't just be in solidarity with Palestine, but at the same time, we have to push forth working, multinational, multi-ethnic working class struggle. And I think that the union leadership is already running up against the resistance of a mass working class base to being in conformity with this regime. And we need to push forward that contradiction between union leadership and a mass base of workers who are facing an absolute disaster. So I hope that that response is helpful. And we need to go back to use the language of class. We stopped using it the last few decades, but now it's time to use it again.
Thank you so much.
I was just wondering if there was anywhere we could find this information.
I'm so sorry, I couldn't hear.
Okay. Hi, I was just wondering if there was anywhere we could find this information that you presented.
Yes. Well, there's two things. One is I asked Amina, I know this is being recorded, and I would request if you could upload the recording to YouTube so we can distribute it, because there are many people that I know couldn't make it today. That's one thing. But in terms of, so you would have access to this. And Mina has I don't believe in intellectual property for public knowledge. So Mina, please do share the PowerPoint with anyone that wants it. But I think the most important thing is to try and get this to up into YouTube so we can sort of mass distribute it. But in terms of also reading and sources, if you want to go beyond the PowerPoint itself, here's some sources that are free and available. There's a written one, an online one is Mondowiss. It's Mondowiss. I don't know how it came into existence. I discovered it in 2023, but it comes literally every day. And it's 1, 2 to 3 articles on what's going on in Palestine on a daily basis, the news headlines from the perspective of Palestinian freedom. That's Mondowiss. Another good source, of course, they represent the Arab elite, but with excellent coverage on the genocide, shocking coverage, of course, and you all know this, is Al Jazeera. And then in terms of books, there's so many great books now. If you want to go into more of the history, for instance, I mentioned anything that Ilan Pappé, P-A-P-P-E, I-L-A-N is the first name. He is a Jewish Israeli in exile in England now. Brilliant historian. You can read The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, but anything he's written. Another really important work, which I've drawn on, is another Jewish Israeli professor of history, who I believe he also had to leave into exile, and the conditions are so terrible for them too. And to London is Shlomo Sand, S-A-N-D. And I really drew heavily in a couple of my slides on his book, the invention of Israel. The invention is somewhere there on the slides. The invention of the Jewish people. How the Zionist project had to take a religion and turn it into an ethnicity that needs a nation state. So there's tons of sources out there. There's endless amount of books. But I mentioned that. And I'm sure I know you have on your campus Jewish Voices for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine. I'm sure that those organizations are have a lot of suggestion for information as well.
Thank you.
Oh, give me one second. I forgot to mention also that Ilan Pape wrote, it just came out like a month ago, so I forgot to mention it. It's a tiny little book. I actually audio listened to it, but I think it's like 90 or 100 pages. If you just have time to read one little thing, or if you want to share with other people that are not politicized about this, something like a short history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. But if you just Google Ilan Pape, P-A-P-P-E, and his most recent book, 2025, tiny little book. It's a wonderful overview introduction to what's going on. Please go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sure. Hi, Professor. My name's Sunny. I'm not a student. I'm an alum. I'm in the community, but I support the students' efforts on campus and what have you. I wanted to kind of summarize 2 points that you kind of identified in your talk that sound pretty actionable for people. On top of like the general project of continuing to organize as a working class, like you mentioned, bringing class back into kind of dialogue and what have you. It sounds like continuing to voice support for Palestine and just increase our efforts around that is one like powerful avenue to fight fascism. And also you mentioned that China is a big supporter of Israel, and if there's some way that we could potentially put some pressure on China to divest from Israel in one way, I noticed that might be an actual tactic as well. Are there any other points of like leverage as a working class that you see, or any other any kinds of escalations that you would recommend or that come to mind immediately?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I have a few comments, but of course I don't have the answers here because we have to come up with the answers collectively. But so pretty much many people are now coming to recognize that on the one hand, the unbelievable heroism of you guys, of our students. When I say our, I mean all over the United States and all over the world. You know, with encampments, I was in touch with students in Mexico, students in Europe, students in Brazil. I mean, there's basically a student uprising all around the world, and that brought a whole lot of attention to the Palestine struggle. So on the one hand, we recognize the incredible heroism and the centrality of student radical activism, and it needs to continue, and you guys are continuing it. They're right now repressing students who, you know, just today, some odd students at Columbia, with all of that repression going on in Columbia. They occupied the library. And in Swarthmore, they're being beaten on the head by police yesterday. Their encampments, they set it up and it's being taken down again. So student activism is central, but we're recognizing now, we meaning us collectively, that the student activism has to link up with organic working class struggle. And I see that you're asking that question, right? That's really the key to moving forward, is how do you link the student activism, so important, with the community working class grounded activism. And so I don't have the specific answer to that, except that right now, the only favor Trump is doing us, he's having us recognize that all of these different attacks against all of our different communities, they're all interconnected. And so at least it opens up space for us to deepen our struggle and make those connections. The other thing is hands-on. What is central really are those sectors of the working class that can directly do something, such as dock workers. And in Spain and in a couple of other countries, the dock workers have really played a key role. The weapons, the ships carrying weapons cannot dock in Spanish ports right now. And so we're really behind here. Of course, the last question was about union leadership and how they block that. But that's a pressure point too. The dock workers have historically in the United States, and you're in the docks in LA, in California, but also Washington and the states of Washington and Oregon have always been militant. So, you know, maybe not the leadership, but the workers. So there's a really key link there that dock workers, if the unions could only be brought on board to not load and unload weapons. And I know that, I think it was in Shanghai, I don't remember, but early in the genocide, there was some protest by Chinese dock workers. And we heard a little bit of news on it, but of course there's censorship and, you know, of information coming out of China. Some people keep trying to say that's, you know, revolutionary country, but not according to the workers in China. So, you know, I don't really have the answers to your question, but I know the way forward is to figure out how to make student worker, well, you are workers as students, but make more organic student worker and worker outside of the university connections. So, I mean, collectively, we have to come up with the answers.
Okay, thank you so much.
And then we'll take two more in the chat. I think that okay. So yeah, Mohammed asks, do you ever see the US ending military support for Israel? And if so, how do you see that happening? And I think that maybe that can connect to Will's question. How do you think that US socialist Marxist working class should be oriented right now in US politics in order to build the power needed to win? Is there a future for the US working class left politics within the Democratic Party in particular?
Yeah, great questions. So our job here in the United States with regard to Palestine is to protest and reverse US unconditional support for Israel and for the project of genocide. That's our role, right, in Palestine solidarity. And what that requires is that we make the cost of the US sponsoring this genocide higher than is the cost of not sponsoring it and of changing policy. Now, there's a long history here. I just want to say a little bit of background on myself. Ever since I'm a teenager, I've known about the Palestinian struggle, but it wasn't until 2009, when I was already a much older person, that it became more central to my own participation in activism and organizing. And it's because in that year, Operation Cast Lead was a massacre of several thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, big bombardment. And I publicly denounced it on my campus, and the Zionists went after me. And it's a 6-month campaign to get rid of me. The reason I'm mentioning that is because from 2009 until present, and if you Google me, William I. Robinson, you'll see some of my writings and my books, but you'll also see some details of that campaign against me. But I'm mentioning that because then I really delved into this as one of my research and areas of study also. And so what you see is that inside the US state, policymakers from before 1948, right up until present, there have been a lot of divisions. So from Truman and on, with the formation of the State of Israel, the role of the US has been to support Israel more and more, especially after 1967, and then especially the 1980s and on. But there has always been opposition internal inside the US state that we don't necessarily see. And the opposition isn't because these policymakers support Palestinian freedom, much less worker struggles. It is because some US policymakers have said we have a bigger economic stake in the stability of the whole Middle East and North Africa because our economic and investment interests are there. So if Israel is destabilizing the region with all of this conflict and alienating Arab capitalists, etc., that's not good for us. So we should change our policy. So right now, we can see the effects of that the Democrats lost the election in part because they defended capital and not workers. That was a big part of the story, segueing into this final question, but also in part because the Democrats sponsored genocide and the unbelievable insults at the Democratic Convention. You'll remember they wouldn't even let a moderate Palestinian speak and let Israeli Zionists speak. So what I'm getting at here is our role in solidarity is unconditional support for the Palestinian freedom struggle, but specifically with the objective of changing US policy. And that means trying to make the cost of sponsoring the Zionist project higher than the cost of changing a policy. So that's not impossible. We're not going to change a policy of promoting capitalism worldwide outside of the working class struggle. But we could potentially see a change of policy against the genocide. Who knows with Trump? I don't know. But then finally, to conclude, I'm proudly a socialist also. I want to overthrow global capitalism. And I finally reached the point with this last election, and with my colleagues, my liberal and left colleagues, we discussed this, but I finally reached the point where I don't see any value in going back to the Democratic Party. I think the actual message of anti-oligarchic working class struggles that Bernie Sanders and AOL are putting out, their message is fine, it's needed, but their message, then the second part of the message is, so now let's go back to the Democrats. And the second part of the message, I think at this point, leads us absolutely nowhere. At the best, if there is elections again in 2028 and the Democrats come back to power, it will simply even create more space for a fascist takeover. So we really need to break with the Democratic Party. We can debate this. You can disagree. I know plenty of people don't believe that that's correct, but that's my position at this point. Once and for all, the working class needs to find its own independent voice, independent politics, and independent political vehicles. And now is the time. Just quote the famous quotes. If not us, who? If not now, when? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone here, and thank you, Professor Robinson, especially with all of what's happening on campus. It's really good to kind of connect these struggles. Yeah. And thank you for bearing with me as I put this together while like on the picket line and not really paying attention to my email. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Keep struggling, everyone.
Press the record button first. I'm trying to make sure that it's
Recording.
I'll stop recording.